My name is Vexthal Kor, and I have commanded warships for 30 cycles of my world's sun. I have never once seen an enemy do what the humans did on that day near the Thren Nebula. I gave the order to surrender. I expected fear. I expected pleading. What I received instead was silence, and then something far worse than defiance. 80 warships of the Thessian Dominion surrounded a single human vessel. Its hull was scarred, its weapons cold on our sensors, its crew complement unknown. We called it the Caldera. It had drifted alone at the edge of the nebula for 6 hours, cut off from any human fleet, any human station, any hope of rescue. My officers told me it was an easy kill. My tactical advisor, a sharp young officer named Drellis, said the ship's engines were barely holding together. I believed her. I had no reason not to. I opened a channel to the Caldera and gave the order myself, because I wanted the satisfaction of hearing a human break. Surrender, I said. My voice carried across every frequency the humans were known to monitor. Power down your weapons. Lower your shields. Your ship is surrounded. There is no path forward except destruction or compliance. There was a pause. 3 full seconds, which on a bridge during a standoff feels like an hour. My crew held their breath. Even I, who had given 1,000 such orders before to lesser enemies, felt my hearts beat faster. Then a voice answered. It was calm, too calm. A human male, his words clipped and precise, with none of the panic I expected. Acknowledged, the voice said. And then, on every screen across my bridge, I watched the shields of the Caldera fall. For a moment, nobody spoke. The bridge crew looked at each other, uncertain whether to celebrate. I felt something twist in my chest. Something I would later understand was the first true instinct of danger I had felt in cycles. Humans did not surrender like this. I had read the reports. I had spoken with officers who had fought them at the border skirmishes, in the asteroid fields near Yuan Station, in the brief and bloody exchange over the Calver Drift. Humans fought until their ships were wrecks. Humans fought when there was no chance of survival. Humans, according to every briefing I had ever received, did not know how to lose gracefully. And yet here it was. Shields down. Weapons silent. A surrender, offered without a single shot fired in protest. Drellis broke the silence first. Commander, should we prepare the boarding teams? I should have paused longer. I should have asked more questions. But 30 cycles of victories had made me arrogant, and arrogance does not pause to ask questions when victory seems handed to it on a tray. I nodded. Prepare 2 teams. Standard procedure. Secure the bridge, secure the engine room, take their command crew into custody. As my officers moved to follow the order, I turned back to my own console and pulled up the sensor readings on the Caldera one more time. A habit more than a need. Something on the display caught my attention and held it. The weapons were listed as powered down, yes, but the heat signature along the hull plating near the forward cannons was inconsistent with a weapon that had been cold for 6 hours. It read more like a weapon that had fired recently, or one that was simply waiting, banked low, ready to ignite again in an instant. I told myself it was a sensor error, old hardware misreading thermal bleed from the ship's reactor. I told myself many things in those final minutes before my world changed, and every single one of them was wrong. There was something else, too. The crew complement. Dominion intelligence listed vessels of the Caldera's class as carrying between 40 and 60 personnel. Our scans, faint as they were through the ship's remaining hull integrity, suggested a number closer to 200. I mentioned this to Drellis. She frowned, ran the scan again, and got the same result. Could be a sensor ghost, she said. Old human tech sometimes throws strange echoes. Could be, I agreed, though I did not believe it. I should have called off the boarding. Looking back now, with everything I have learned since, that single decision sits at the center of everything that followed. But I did not call it off. I gave the order to proceed, because I was Vexthal Kor, commander of 80 warships, and I did not believe a single broken human vessel could threaten me. The boarding teams launched from 2 of my cruisers, small shuttles cutting silently through the gap between our fleet and the Caldera's drifting hull. I watched through their helmet cameras as they approached the breach point near the ship's primary airlock. The metal around the airlock was scorched, but the door itself opened smoothly when our engineers applied the override codes. Too smoothly, I would think later, as if it had been left unlocked on purpose. The first thing my team reported was the silence. Not the silence of a dead ship, with its hum of failing systems and dying power cores, but a deliberate, controlled silence. Lights were on. Air was breathable. The corridors were clean, almost sterile, as if someone had prepared the ship for visitors, rather than defended it from invaders. No resistance, my lead boarding officer reported, his voice tight with the kind of confusion that comes when expectations and reality do not match. Repeat, no resistance. Corridors are clear. We are advancing toward the bridge. I watched the feed from his helmet as the team moved deeper into the ship. Every door opened for them. Every junction was lit, guiding them forward as if the corridors themselves wanted my soldiers to reach their destination quickly. I should have recognized this as control, not coincidence. I did not yet. It took 11 minutes for the team to reach the bridge of the caldera, 11 minutes of empty hallways, locked storage rooms that opened on command, and a strange, growing unease that even I could feel through the second-hand view of a helmet camera. When the bridge door finally opened, my soldiers found exactly one person inside. A woman, seated calmly in the command chair, her posture relaxed, her hands folded in her lap. She did not flinch when the door opened. She did not reach for a weapon. She simply turned her head toward the camera, toward me, even though she could not have known I was watching, and spoke. "You should leave now," she said. Her voice matched the one I had heard over the comm channel earlier, though I could not be certain it was the same person. This was never a surrender. It was a courtesy. My lead officer hesitated, then keyed his comm. "Commander, she is unarmed. Orders?" I felt something cold settle into my chest, a feeling I had not experienced since my earliest days in combat, before victories had dulled my caution. But I was not a young officer anymore. I was Vexthal Core, and I would not be unsettled by a single human's strange words. "Take her into custody," I ordered. "Secure the rest of the ship. Report any other personnel immediately." My officer nodded to his team, and two of them stepped forward to restrain the woman. She did not resist. She simply watched them approach with an expression that I can only describe, now, as pity. Not fear, not anger. Pity, the kind one feels watching someone walk toward a danger they cannot yet see. "Last chance," she said quietly, just before my soldiers reached her. "Tell your commander to listen carefully to what comes next." And then, across every screen on my bridge, the feed from the boarding team dissolved into static. I shouted for my communications officer to restore the signal. She worked frantically at her console, fingers moving across controls that suddenly seemed unresponsive. "Commander, I am not losing the signal," she said, panic creeping into her voice for the first time. "Something is redirecting it. The data is still flowing. It is just not coming to us." I stood from my chair, every instinct screaming that something had gone deeply wrong, though I still did not understand the shape of the danger closing around me. Around the bridge, my crew exchanged glances, the kind of glances soldiers share when they sense that the battle they trained for is not the battle they are about to fight. I ordered a second sensor sweep of the entire caldera, hoping to re-establish some kind of clarity. What came back instead deepened the mystery, rather than solving it. The ship's internal systems, which moments ago had read as failing and barely operational, now showed power readings climbing steadily, not in a way consistent with a ship preparing to fight, but in a way consistent with something else entirely, something I did not yet have a name for, a system waking up. I turned to Drellis. "Status of our boarding teams." "No response, Commander. Both teams have gone dark. Life signs are still registering, but we have lost all communication. Not dead, just silent." Somehow that was worse. I made the decision then, to recall my remaining shuttle crews, and pull back to a defensive formation around the fleet, a decision that, in hindsight, came far too late to matter. As my orders went out across the comm network, my own console flickered, just for a moment, displaying a string of characters I did not recognize before returning to normal. I dismissed it as interference. I dismissed nearly everything that day as interference, right up until the moment I no longer could. Outside my viewport, the caldera sat motionless among my fleet, its hull dark against the glow of the nebula, betraying nothing of what was happening inside it, or what it had already done to the rest of my command. I remember staring at it, this single, broken-looking human ship, and feeling for the first time in 30 cycles that I was not the one in control of this engagement. I was wrong about so many things that day. I was wrong about the woman on the bridge. I was wrong about the silence in the corridors. I was wrong about the shields falling, which I had taken as weakness, but which I would soon learn was something else entirely. A message, a warning, a demonstration, aimed not just at me, but at every species watching from the shadows of the galaxy, waiting to see what would happen when the Dominion finally pushed humanity too far. I did not know it yet, standing on my bridge with 80 warships at my command, and a strange unease settling into my bones. But the true battle had not yet begun. What I had witnessed so far was only the opening move, a single quiet gesture before the storm. And as my fleet drifted in silence around that one human ship, I felt, for the first time in my long career, something I had never allowed myself to feel before. I felt afraid. The feeling did not leave me. If anything, it grew sharper with every passing second, as my crew worked desperately to restore contact with the boarding teams, as my sensors continued to report readings that made no sense, as the caldera sat there, dark and patient, like a predator that had already won and was simply waiting for the rest of us to realize it. I had given the order to surrender. I had expected to receive a broken enemy in return. Instead, I had received silence, a single calm voice, and a warning I had been too proud to heed. Whatever came next, I understood with sudden and complete certainty, would not be a battle I controlled. It would be a lesson, and I was about to learn just how much I did not know about the species we had spent 3 years calling weak. The silence from my boarding teams stretched into minutes, and minutes on a warship during a crisis feel like hours. I paced my bridge, watching my crew work their consoles with the kind of frantic focus that comes when training meets a situation training never prepared them for. Drellis kept her voice steady, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands moved a fraction too quickly across her controls. "Still no signal from either team," she reported. "Life signs are stable, heart rates elevated, but within normal range. Whatever is happening to them, it does not appear to be causing them harm." That should have comforted me. It did not. A captor who does not harm their prisoners is often more dangerous than one who does, because it means they have a plan that does not require violence to succeed. I ordered a full sensor sweep of the entire engagement zone, hoping to find some clue, some pattern I could use to understand what we were facing. What came back instead was a report I almost refused to believe. My communications officer, a steady young man named Owen Brooks, turned to me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between confusion and dread. "Commander, I am receiving emergency transmissions. Multiple fleets, multiple sectors." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "Fleet Commander Yulin Vass, reporting from the Korath border. Fleet Commander Theshik Orr, reporting from the Belwyn cluster. Both report identical incidents to ours. Human vessels offering surrender, shields dropping, boarding teams going silent." The bridge fell quiet. Even the constant hum of the ship's systems seemed to fade into the background, as the weight of what Owen had said settled over us. This was not one ship. This was not one isolated incident born from some desperate human captain's last gambit. This was coordinated. This was deliberate. And it was happening across our entire border with human space, all at once, with a precision that suggested planning on a scale I had never imagined humans capable of. I sat down slowly, my mind racing through every report, every briefing, every conversation I had ever had about humanity and their capabilities. We had always assessed them as aggressive, stubborn, willing to fight far past the point where any reasonable species would surrender. That assessment had been built on years of observed behavior at the border, skirmishes where human ships fought to the last system rather than yield an inch of territory. Nothing in those reports had prepared me for this. Nothing had suggested that humans were capable of this kind of widespread, silent, simultaneous action across multiple fronts. "Commander," Drellis said quietly, "if this is happening everywhere, then it was never about this one ship. It was never about the caldera at all." I understood what she meant, though the full shape of it was still forming in my mind. The caldera's surrender had not been a tactical decision made by one captain in one desperate moment. It had been the trigger for something larger, something that had been planned and prepared long before my fleet ever arrived at the edge of the Thren Nebula. We had not cornered a wounded animal. We had walked into a trap that spanned the entire length of human space, and we had walked into it without ever realizing the trap had already been set. I forced myself to think clearly, to set aside the rising fear, and focus on what I could still control. "Pull back the rest of our shuttle crews," I ordered. "No further boarding attempts. I want full defensive postures on every ship in the fleet. Raise our own shields and keep them at maximum strength." The order to raise shields came a fraction too late. As my crew scrambled to comply, the lighting on my bridge flickered, just for a moment, the same strange flicker I had dismissed as interference only minutes before. This time, it did not stop. The main display in front of me, the one showing the tactical layout of my fleet against the caldera, began to distort, lines of code bleeding through the image, like ink spreading through water. "Commander, I am losing control of the tactical display," reported my systems officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Grace Whitfield, who had served with me for nearly a decade. Her voice carried a tightness I had rarely heard from her, even during our most difficult engagements. "Something is moving through our network. I cannot isolate it." I felt my heart's race as I watched the display continue to distort, the careful tactical readout of my fleet, dissolving into something I no longer recognized. "Cut external communications," I ordered. "Isolate every system from outside contact immediately." "Already attempting that, Commander," Grace replied, her fingers flying across her console. "It is not responding to standard isolation protocols. Whatever this is, it is already inside our network." I understood then, with a clarity that felt like cold water poured over my head, exactly how the boarding teams had gone silent. Exactly how the boarding teams had gone silent. Exactly how the boarding teams had gone silent. This was never about soldiers storming through corridors, or weapons firing across the void between ships. This was a different kind of battle entirely. One fought not with cannons and shields but with code and signals, with vulnerabilities buried so deep in our own systems that we had never thought to look for them. I thought back to a report I had dismissed years ago, filed by a defector who had once served in human space before fleeing to Dominion territory. He had spoken of humanity's strange evolution after their early wars, how they had grown disillusioned with weapons that simply destroyed, and had begun investing instead in something subtler: information warfare, systems that could turn an enemy's own technology against them without firing a single shot. At the time, I had considered it the rambling of a frightened defector trying to make himself seem valuable to his new hosts. I had filed the report away and moved on, certain that no species could weaponize something so intangible to such devastating effect. I had been wrong. The thought settled into me with a weight I had not expected, heavier than any physical blow I had ever taken in combat. I had been wrong about humanity from the very beginning, and that wrongness was now spreading through my fleet like a fever, ship by ship, system by system, with no end in sight. "Commander," Owen called out, his voice rising with urgency, "I am receiving reports from 3 more fleets. The pattern is spreading. Ships are losing internal control. Crews are being locked out of critical systems, and in at least 2 cases, entire vessels have gone completely dark, drifting without power." I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady myself, trying to think like the commander I had always believed myself to be, rather than the frightened officer I now felt like underneath the uniform. "Casualties?" I asked, almost afraid of the answer. "None reported, Commander. Not yet, at least. The crews are alive. Just locked out, trapped inside their own ships, unable to control anything." That detail, more than anything else, told me something important about what we were facing. Whoever had designed this, whoever had built whatever system was now spreading through Dominion vessels across multiple fronts, had not designed it to kill. They had designed it to disable, to humiliate, to demonstrate a kind of power that did not require destruction to be devastating. That restraint, that deliberate choice not to take lives when the opportunity was clearly there, frightened me more than outright violence ever could have. It meant this was not desperation. It meant this was a message, carefully crafted and precisely delivered. I turned to Grace, watching her continue her desperate work at the systems console even as more of our network slipped beyond her control. "Can you trace the source? Can you tell me exactly how this began?" She nodded slowly, not looking up from her console. "I have been working on that since the first anomaly appeared. As far as I can determine, the breach originated through our standard hailing frequency protocols, the same channel we used to broadcast the surrender demand to the caldera. There appears to be embedded code within the response signal we received, something that activated the moment our systems processed it. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We had done this to ourselves. The very act of demanding surrender, of opening a channel and waiting for a response, had been the mechanism through which this entire crisis had begun. We had not been defeated through force. We had been defeated through our own protocol, our own procedure, exploited with a precision that suggested the humans had studied our communication systems far more closely than we had ever studied theirs. How long have they had access to our hailing frequencies? I asked, though I already suspected I would not like the answer. Unknown, Commander. Based on the sophistication of what I am seeing, it could be months. It could be years. This is not something built in a single afternoon in response to today's engagement. This was prepared long before we ever arrived at the Thren Nebula. I sat in silence for a long moment, letting that truth settle over me. We had spent 3 years fighting humanity at the border, certain of our own technological superiority, certain that our weapons and our shields and our numbers would always be enough to secure victory. We had never once considered that the true battlefield might exist somewhere we could not see, in the code running beneath our own systems, in vulnerabilities we had never bothered to search for, because we had never imagined an enemy capable of finding them. The bridge around me had grown quiet, my crew working in tense, focused silence as they tried to salvage whatever control remained over our ship. I looked out through the main viewport at the caldera, still drifting silently among my fleet, its dark hull betraying nothing of the storm it had unleashed. It had not fired a single weapon. It had not launched a single fighter, and yet it had brought 80 warships, and apparently many more besides across multiple sectors, to the edge of total paralysis without a single shot being exchanged. I thought of the woman on the bridge of that ship, her calm voice, her expression of quiet pity as my soldiers approached her. She had known exactly what was about to happen. She had given us a chance to walk away, and we had been too arrogant, too confident in our own superiority, to take it. "Commander," Drellis said softly, drawing my attention back to the present. "Orders?" I looked at her, at the rest of my crew, all of them watching me, waiting for direction, in a situation none of us had ever been trained to face. I did not have an easy answer. I did not have a clever tactic that would reverse what was already happening, that would restore control over the systems already slipping from our grasp. All I had was the growing certainty that we had badly misjudged the species we had spent years calling weak, and that the cost of that misjudgment was only beginning to reveal itself. "Maintain what control we can," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "Keep trying to isolate the breach. And get me a direct channel to the caldera. If they wanted to talk, then we are going to talk." As Owen worked to establish the connection, I allowed myself one more look at the tactical display, what remained visible of it through the distortion spreading across our network. 80 warships, once a symbol of unquestioned dominance, now sat scattered and vulnerable around a single human vessel that had never needed to fire a weapon to bring us to our knees. Whatever happened next, I understood with growing certainty, would not be decided by the size of my fleet or the strength of my shields. It would be decided by something far more dangerous, something I was only just beginning to understand. The channel opened, and I prepared myself to speak with whoever, or whatever, waited on the other end, knowing that nothing I said in the next few minutes would change the fact that we had already lost a battle we never realized we were fighting. The channel connected with a soft chime that felt almost mocking in its calmness, given everything unraveling around me. I straightened in my chair, trying to project an authority I no longer fully felt, and waited for a response from the other end. It was not the woman from the bridge who answered, but a man, his voice carrying the same measured calm that had characterized every human communication since this engagement began. "Fleet Commander Vexthal Kor," he said, and the use of my full name and title sent a fresh wave of unease through me. They had known exactly who commanded this fleet before they ever offered their surrender. "My name is Daniel Hart. I imagine you have questions." "I have many questions," I admitted, deciding that pretense would serve no purpose with an enemy who had already demonstrated such thorough knowledge of my fleet and my command. "Why surrender if you never intended to be captured? Why drop your shields only to unleash whatever this is upon my fleet?" There was a pause, brief but deliberate, as if Daniel Hart was considering how much to reveal. "We did not unleash anything, Commander. We simply stopped protecting ourselves from a threat that no longer required protection against. The shields were never what kept the caldera safe. They were a formality, maintained out of habit more than necessity. I frowned, trying to make sense of the distinction he was drawing. Then what does keep your ship safe, if not your shields and your weapons? Another pause. The same thing that has been keeping our entire fleet safe since long before this war began. Information, Commander. Control over the very systems your ships rely on to function. We did not need to fight you with cannons because we had already won the only fight that mattered, the one neither side ever officially declared. I felt a chill settle deeper into my chest as the implications of his words sank in. Across the galaxy, every species understood warfare in terms of ships and weapons, of fleets meeting in the void and the stronger force emerging victorious. We had built our entire military doctrine around that understanding. Our shields, our cannons, our tactics, all designed to counter an enemy who would meet us on those same terms. Humanity, it seemed, had abandoned that framework entirely, choosing instead to fight a war we did not even know we were participating in. You are telling me this was planned, I said slowly, that everything happening to my fleet right now was prepared in advance, waiting for the right moment to activate. I am telling you that humanity stopped relying on physical defenses generations ago, Commander, not because we lacked the capability to build them, but because we recognized that a more permanent kind of security existed elsewhere. Your fleet's vulnerability was not discovered today. It was identified years ago, studied, mapped, and prepared for, waiting only for a moment like this one to be put into use. I thought of the defectors' report I had dismissed so easily, the rambling warnings about humanity's strange evolution after their early wars. I had filed it away as irrelevant, the exaggerated fears of a frightened man trying to justify his defection. Now I understood, with a clarity that felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, that I had dismissed the single most important piece of intelligence my dominion had ever received about the species we now found ourselves at war with. Why? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Why prepare such a thing, and then never use it, until now? Why allow 3 years of border conflict, 3 years of losses on both sides, if you held this capability the entire time? Daniel Hart's voice, when he answered, carried something I had not expected. Not pride, not triumph, but something closer to weariness. Because we did not want to use it, Commander. Humanity has learned, through painful experience, that overwhelming power used too quickly only breeds more conflict, more resentment, more cycles of violence that never truly end. We held this capability in reserve because we hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the border skirmishes might eventually settle into something resembling peace, that your dominion might come to see us as something other than an enemy to be conquered. And now? I asked. And now your fleet surrounded a single ship, demanded its surrender, and prepared to board it without hesitation, without consideration for what such an action might provoke. We made a choice, Commander, to demonstrate exactly what restraint we had been showing all along, and exactly what we are capable of when that restraint is no longer the wisest course. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing through the implications of everything I had just heard. This was not simply a tactical victory humanity had achieved over my fleet. It was a message, deliberately staged and broadcast across multiple sectors simultaneously, designed to be witnessed not just by Dominion forces, but by every other species watching from the shadows of this conflict, every neutral party weighing whether to align with us or with humanity in the years to come. What happens now? I asked, forcing the question out despite the dread building in my chest. To my fleet, to my crews, to the soldiers I sent aboard your ship. Your boarding teams are unharmed, Daniel Hart said. They will be returned to you shortly, along with control of their shuttle. As for the rest of your fleet, system control will be restored gradually over the next several hours, ship by ship, once we are satisfied that the demonstration has served its purpose. And if it has not served its purpose? I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Then we will need to have a different kind of conversation, Commander. One I would very much prefer to avoid. The channel closed before I could respond further, leaving me alone with my thoughts, and the slowly worsening chaos still spreading through my fleet's systems. I looked around my bridge at my crew, all of them watching me with expressions ranging from fear to confusion to a kind of stunned disbelief that mirrored my own. We had entered this engagement as the unquestioned dominant force, certain of our victory before a single shot had been fired. We were leaving it, or would soon leave it, having learned that victory in this new kind of war had never depended on the size of our fleet or the strength of our shields at all. Drellis approached my chair quietly, her voice low enough that only I could hear it. "Commander, what do we tell Dominion Command? How do we explain what happened here today?" It was a question I had been avoiding even in my own thoughts, because I did not yet have an answer that did not sound like an admission of catastrophic failure. How does one explain to a governing council that an entire fleet, the pride of the Dominion's border defenses, had been brought to a standstill by a single ship that never fired a weapon? How does one explain that the enemy we had spent 3 years dismissing as primitive and aggressive had, in fact, been holding back a capability that could cripple our forces at will? "We tell them the truth," I said finally, though the words felt heavy as I spoke them. "We tell them that everything we believed about humanity was wrong, and that continuing this war on the assumption that our technological superiority guarantees victory would be a catastrophic mistake." Drellis nodded slowly, though I could see in her expression that she understood, as I did, how poorly such a report would be received by a Dominion command that had built its entire strategic doctrine on the assumption of inevitable victory over an inferior species. Over the next hour, I watched as system after system slowly returned to my control, exactly as Daniel Hart had promised. The strange distortions on my tactical display faded, replaced by clean, accurate readouts. Communications stabilized, engine controls, weapon systems, life support, all of it returned to normal function, as if an invisible hand had simply released its grip on my ship and allowed it to breathe again. My boarding teams returned as well, their shuttle drifting back from the caldera under its own power, the soldiers aboard reporting no injuries, no harm of any kind, only a strange and disorienting period during which they had found themselves completely unable to move or act, frozen in place by something none of them could explain or even fully describe. The woman who had spoken to them on the bridge of the caldera was gone by the time they regained control of their own bodies, the bridge empty, except for the quiet hum of a ship that had already accomplished everything it set out to do. I debriefed my soldiers personally, listening carefully as they described the strange paralysis, the sense of being watched and assessed even as they stood helpless within a stranger's ship. None of them could explain the mechanism behind what had happened to them, only that it had felt deliberate, controlled, and entirely without malice, as if their captors had simply wanted to demonstrate a point rather than cause them harm. As the last of my fleet's systems returned to full function, I ordered a final sensor sweep of the area surrounding the caldera, only to find that the ship itself had vanished, slipping away into the depths of the nebula sometime during the chaos of the past several hours, leaving no trace behind except the lingering knowledge of everything it had shown us. I stood at my viewport for a long while after that, staring out into the swirling colors of the Thren Nebula, trying to process everything that had happened in the span of a single engagement. We had arrived expecting an easy victory over a wounded enemy. We were leaving with our entire understanding of that enemy shattered, replaced by a far more dangerous truth than any of us had been prepared to face. Humanity had not won this engagement through superior firepower or overwhelming numbers. They had won it by demonstrating, with perfect clarity, that our shields and our weapons had never been the deciding factor in any conflict between our two species. The true battlefield existed somewhere else entirely, in the code and the signals and the systems we relied on, without ever questioning their security. And on that battlefield, humanity had already secured a victory so complete that we had not even realized the war was being fought. I returned to my chair and began drafting my report to Dominion Command, knowing that the words I chose would determine how seriously the Council took the threat we had just witnessed firsthand. I chose them carefully, knowing that the future of the Dominion's entire strategy against humanity might depend on whether my superiors believed what I was about to tell them, or dismissed it as the panicked exaggeration of a commander who had simply been outmaneuvered in a single engagement. I did not yet know that my report would be the first of many such reports flooding into Dominion Command from fleets across the border, each one describing the same impossible scenario, the same calm human voices, the same quiet demonstrations of power that left no bodies behind, but shattered every assumption we had ever held about the species we called our enemy. I did not yet know that the conversation Daniel Hart had warned me about, the one he had hoped to avoid, was already beginning, not in any single engagement, but in the slow, dawning realization spreading across the entire Dominion that we had been fighting the wrong war all along. For now, I simply sat at my console, the nebula glowing softly beyond my viewport, and tried to make sense of a galaxy that had, in the span of a single afternoon, become far stranger and far more dangerous than I had ever believed it could be. 3 days passed before Dominion Command summoned me to answer for what had happened at the Thren Nebula. 3 days during which I barely slept, replaying the engagement over and over in my mind, searching for some decision I could have made differently, some warning sign I should have caught sooner. I found none that would have changed the outcome. By the time my fleet had entered that nebula, the trap, if it could even be called that, had already been set long before any of us arrived. The summons came through a secure channel, directly from Council Chamber Theris, the seat of Dominion military authority, located deep within our homeworld's capital. I had stood before that council only twice before in my career, both times to receive commendations for victories that had seemed, at the time, to confirm everything we believed about our place in the galaxy. This time would be different, and I knew it the moment the summons arrived. I transferred command of my fleet temporarily to Drellis, and boarded a transport bound for the capital, spending the long journey drafting and redrafting the words I would use to explain what had happened. Every version I wrote sounded inadequate, either too alarmist to be taken seriously, or too measured to convey the true scope of the danger we now faced. In the end, I decided simply to tell the truth as plainly as I could, and let the council make of it what they would. The chamber was exactly as I remembered it, a vast circular room, dominated by tiered seating, where the highest-ranking officers of the Dominion military gathered to deliberate matters of war and strategy. I stood at the center, beneath the harsh white light that illuminated every speaker who addressed the council, and waited as the assembled officers settled into their seats, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. Grand Marshal Kethis Drawl presided over the session, an officer whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had earned him both respect and fear throughout the Dominion's military hierarchy. He regarded me with an expression I could not quite read, as the chamber fell silent, waiting for me to begin my report. "Commander Kor," he said, his voice carrying easily through the chamber without need for amplification. "You commanded 80 warships at the Thren Nebula. You now stand before this council to explain how a single human vessel rendered that fleet inoperable without firing a single weapon. Begin." I took a breath and began my account, describing the engagement from the initial standoff through the surrender, the boarding attempt, the strange silence that had fallen over my soldiers, and the cascading failure of my fleet's systems that had followed. I described my conversation with Daniel Hart, the explanation he had offered, and the slow restoration of control that had come only after humanity had made their point with perfect, deliberate clarity. As I spoke, I watched the faces of the assembled officers shift from skepticism to something closer to alarm, though several among them maintained expressions of stubborn disbelief throughout my entire report. When I finished, a long silence settled over the chamber before Grand Marshal Drawl spoke again. "You are suggesting, Commander, that humanity possesses the capability to disable an entire Dominion fleet without engaging in direct combat, that they have held this capability for years, perhaps longer, without using it, and that they chose, for reasons of their own, to demonstrate it now, across multiple sectors simultaneously, as some manner of warning." "That is precisely what I am suggesting, Grand Marshal," I said, "and I would urge this council to take the warning seriously, because I do not believe humanity intends to offer a second demonstration before taking more decisive action." An officer I did not recognize, seated several tiers above me, rose to speak. "With respect, Commander, this account sounds more like an excuse for a humiliating defeat than a credible military assessment. Perhaps your fleet simply suffered a coordinated sabotage attack, planted by spies within your own ranks, rather than some impossible demonstration of human technological supremacy." The accusation stung, though I had expected something like it. Pride, I had learned, made for a powerful blindness, and the Dominion's pride in its own technological and military superiority had been a cornerstone of our identity for generations. Admitting that humanity, a species we had dismissed as primitive aggressors for years, had somehow developed capabilities beyond our own understanding, was not an admission this council would make easily, regardless of the evidence presented before them. "I have served the Dominion for 30 cycles," I replied, keeping my voice steady, despite the anger building beneath my composure. "I know the difference between sabotage and a deliberate demonstration of capability. What happened at the Thren Nebula was the latter, and I would remind this council that identical incidents were reported simultaneously across at least 5 other engagement zones along our border, all occurring within minutes of each other. That is not the work of spies within a single fleet. That is coordinated action on a scale none of us anticipated." Grand Marshal Drow raised a hand, silencing the murmurs that had begun to spread through the chamber. "Commander Kor is correct on this point. We have received corroborating reports from 4 other fleet commanders, each describing remarkably similar circumstances. Whatever occurred at the Thren Nebula was not isolated to his command." The chamber fell silent again, the weight of that confirmation settling over the assembled officers. I watched as expressions shifted once more, skepticism giving way, for some at least, to genuine concern. Others, I noticed, simply grew angrier, as if the confirmation of humanity's capabilities was itself an insult that demanded immediate retaliation rather than careful consideration. "Then what do you propose, Commander?" Grand Marshal Drall asked, turning his full attention back to me. "You have delivered your warning. What action do you believe this council should take in response?" I had considered this question extensively during my journey to the capital, and I answered carefully, knowing that whatever I suggested would likely determine the course of the war for years to come. "I believe we must reassess our entire approach to this conflict, Grand Marshal. Our strategy has been built on the assumption that technological and military superiority guarantees eventual victory. That assumption no longer holds. If humanity can disable our fleets without engaging in combat, then continuing to press this war through conventional means risks catastrophic losses, not just of ships and soldiers, but of the Dominions standing among every other species watching this conflict unfold." "You are suggesting we seek peace," said the same skeptical officer from before, his tone dripping with contempt. "You are suggesting the Dominions surrender to a species we have spent 3 years fighting at the border, simply because they demonstrated a clever trick with our communication systems." "I am suggesting," I replied, my patience wearing thin, "that we recognized when an enemy has demonstrated capabilities beyond our own, and that we adjust our strategy accordingly, rather than continuing to bleed soldiers and resources into a conflict we may no longer be able to win through force alone." The debate that followed stretched on for hours, officers arguing back and forth over the proper response, some advocating for an immediate and overwhelming retaliatory strike to restore Dominion prestige, others urging caution and a reassessment of our entire approach to the human threat. I stood through most of it, answering questions as they arose, watching the council struggle to reconcile their wounded pride with the cold reality of what had happened at the Thren Nebula. In the end, no clear resolution emerged from that first session. Grand Marshal Drall ordered a full investigation into the technical aspects of the breach, hoping to find some defense against future demonstrations of similar capability, while also authorizing a cautious diplomatic inquiry to determine whether humanity might be open to discussing terms that did not involve further escalation. It was not the decisive action some officers had demanded, nor the full strategic retreat others had feared, but a careful middle path that reflected the Council's genuine uncertainty about how to proceed against an enemy whose true capabilities remained largely unknown to us. I returned to my fleet 3 days later, my mind heavy with everything I had witnessed in the Council chamber, the mixture of fear and stubborn pride that had colored every officer's response to a threat none of us fully understood. As my transport approached my flagship, I found myself thinking again of Daniel Hart's words, his warning that humanity had hoped, however foolishly, that the border conflict might eventually settle into something resembling peace. I wondered, as I had wondered many times over the preceding days, whether the Dominion's response would push that hope further out of reach, or whether the Council's cautious diplomatic inquiry might actually open a path toward something other than continued conflict. I did not know the answer, and I suspected that even Daniel Hart, with all the foresight humanity seemed to possess, could not have predicted with certainty how the Dominion would respond to such an unprecedented demonstration of power. When I returned to my bridge, the Relis greeted me with a datapad containing the latest reports from across the border. 2 more incidents had occurred in the days since the Thren Nebula engagement, both following the same pattern. Human ships offering quiet surrenders that turned into demonstrations of overwhelming technological control rather than genuine capitulation. In both cases, no casualties had been reported, and in both cases, the affected fleets had eventually regained control of their systems after several hours of complete paralysis. "They are not trying to destroy us," Drellis observed quietly as I reviewed the reports. "If they wanted to, Commander, surely they could have caused far more damage than this. Disabled systems and frightened crews are nothing compared to what they could have done if their intention was truly to harm us." I nodded slowly, the same thought having occurred to me many times since my conversation with Daniel Hart. "I believe that is precisely the point they are trying to make, Drellis. They want us to understand that restraint, not weakness, has shaped every interaction we have had with them so far. They want us to recognize that the war we have been fighting, the one we believed we were winning through superior force, was never the war that mattered most." I spent the following weeks overseeing a quiet but significant shift in my fleet's operations, implementing new security protocols around our communication systems, retraining my crews to recognize and respond to the kind of subtle intrusion that had so thoroughly compromised us at the Thren Nebula. It was difficult, painstaking work, made all the more frustrating by the knowledge that whatever defenses we developed might already be obsolete against capabilities we did not yet fully understand. Throughout this period, reports continued to filter in from across the Dominion's border with human space, each one describing variations on the same theme, careful demonstrations of capability that stopped short of true destruction, but left no doubt about the power humanity held in reserve. Some among my fellow commanders began to speak quietly of a growing fear that had not existed before, a recognition that the species we had so confidently dismissed as primitive aggressors might, in fact, possess a level of control over the battlefield that made conventional military doctrine almost meaningless. I did not know, during those long weeks of uncertainty and quiet preparation, that the true scope of humanity's demonstration had not yet been fully revealed. I did not know that the careful, measured restraint shown at the Thren Nebula and across the other engagement zones was itself part of a larger message, one that would not become fully clear until word of these incidents spread beyond Dominion space entirely, reaching the ears of every other species watching our conflict unfold from the relative safety of neutral territory. That revelation, when it finally came, would change everything I thought I understood about the war we had been fighting, and about the true nature of the species that had, in a single afternoon near a quiet nebula, shattered every assumption the Dominion had ever held about its place among the stars. The full truth reached me 6 weeks after the Thren Nebula, delivered not through official Dominion channels but through a private message from an unexpected source. Ambassador Lucas Bryant, a human diplomat stationed at the neutral trade station of Calwyn Reach, requested a direct audience with me, citing my role in the original engagement as reason enough for the unusual request. Dominion Command, eager for any insight into human intentions, approved the meeting, and I found myself traveling to Calwyn Reach with a mixture of curiosity and lingering unease that had never fully left me since that day near the nebula. Calwyn Reach existed as one of the few truly neutral territories in this region of the galaxy, a sprawling station maintained jointly by several smaller species who had long ago decided that survival depended on staying out of the larger conflicts surrounding them. I had visited the station only once before, years earlier, and found it largely unchanged, a maze of corridors filled with traders and diplomats from a dozen different worlds, all moving with the careful neutrality of people who understood exactly how precarious their position truly was. Lucas Bryant met me in a private chamber near the station's diplomatic quarter, a quiet space far removed from the bustling commerce outside. He was younger than I expected, his expression carrying none of the calculated calm I had come to associate with the humans I had encountered during the Thren Nebula incident. If anything, he seemed tired, weighed down by something he clearly intended to share with me. "Commander Kor," he said, gesturing for me to sit across from him at a simple table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I imagine you have spent the past 6 weeks trying to understand exactly what happened to your fleet, and why." "I have," I admitted, "though I confess my understanding remains incomplete. Your government has offered little explanation beyond what I learned directly during the engagement itself." Lucas nodded slowly. "That is, in part, why I requested this meeting. There are things I believe you deserve to know, things that may help you understand not just what happened that day, but why it had to happen the way it did. He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. What occurred at the Thren Nebula was not an isolated demonstration aimed solely at your fleet, Commander. It was part of a much larger message, one intended to be witnessed by every species currently observing the conflict between humanity and the Dominion, including the neutral powers here at Calwyn Reach and across dozens of similar stations throughout this region. I felt a familiar chill settle over me as I absorbed his words. You are saying this was never simply about my fleet. It was a demonstration staged for an audience far larger than the Dominion alone. Precisely, Lucas confirmed. For years, the neutral species in this region have watched the conflict between our two governments with growing concern, uncertain whether to align with the Dominion, with humanity, or to continue avoiding involvement entirely. Many among them have begun to believe that the Dominion's military strength makes eventual victory inevitable, and that aligning against humanity would be the safer long-term choice. We needed them to understand that assumption was deeply mistaken. I sat back in my chair, the full scope of what humanity had accomplished finally becoming clear to me. The Thren Nebula incident, along with the simultaneous demonstrations across multiple sectors of the border, had not been intended primarily to weaken the Dominion's military capability, though it had certainly accomplished that as well. It had been designed, from the very beginning, as a message to every watching species in the region, a clear and unmistakable demonstration of the true balance of power between humanity and the Empire that had spent 3 years insisting it held the upper hand. Word of what happened to your fleet spread quickly through neutral channels, Lucas continued. Combined with the identical incidents reported across other sectors, it has fundamentally shifted how many of the smaller powers in this region view the conflict. Several have already begun quiet discussions about establishing formal relations with humanity, recognizing that our restraint during the border skirmishes was a choice, not a limitation. I considered his words carefully, thinking back to my own assumptions before the Thren Nebula, the certainty I had carried for 3 years, that humanity's aggressive resistance at the border stemmed from desperation rather than deliberate strategy. You allowed us to believe we held the advantage, I said slowly. For 3 years, you allowed the Dominion to believe humanity was simply a stubborn, primitive enemy, fighting a losing battle, when in truth, you held capabilities that could have ended the conflict at any moment. We did, Lucas confirmed, his expression growing more solemn. And I will not pretend that choice came without cost, Commander. Soldiers on both sides died during those 3 years of border conflict, soldiers who might have been spared if we had revealed our true capabilities sooner. We made that choice because we believed, perhaps naively, that the Dominion might eventually choose peace on its own, without needing to be shown the full extent of what we were capable of. And when that hope proved unfounded? I asked. Then we chose a different approach, Lucas said simply. One that would make continued conflict so clearly unwise that even the most stubborn voices within your military command would be forced to reconsider their position. The demonstration at the Thren Nebula, and across every other engagement zone that day, was designed to make that choice as clear and as bloodless as possible, while still leaving no room for doubt about what humanity could accomplish if pushed further. I sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything Lucas had revealed. The careful restraint shown by Daniel Hart and the woman aboard the Caldera, the deliberate choice to disable rather than destroy, the simultaneous timing across multiple sectors designed to maximize the impact of the demonstration without causing a single death. All of it now made sense as part of a far larger strategy than I had ever imagined possible during those chaotic hours near the nebula. What do you want from the Dominion now? I asked finally. If this was truly a message rather than an act of aggression, what response are you hoping to receive? Lucas considered the question carefully before answering. We want what we have always wanted, Commander, an end to the conflict that does not require either side to accept permanent subjugation. We are not interested in conquering the Dominion, nor in proving our superiority through continued displays of force. We simply want your government to understand, clearly and completely, that continuing this war offers no realistic path to victory, and that genuine negotiation remains possible, provided your council is willing to engage in good faith. I returned to my fleet from that meeting, with a perspective fundamentally different from the one I had carried throughout my entire career, one shaped by years of Dominion doctrine that had taught me to view military strength as the ultimate measure of a civilization's worth and capability. What I had witnessed at the Thren Nebula, and what Lucas Bryant had confirmed during our meeting at Calwyn Reach, suggested a different kind of strength entirely, one measured not by the willingness to destroy an enemy, but by the restraint shown even when destruction remained well within reach. I submitted a second report to Dominion Command, following my meeting with Lucas Bryant, detailing everything I had learned about humanity's broader strategy and the shifting attitudes among the neutral powers observing our conflict. This time, the response from the Council carried a different tone than the skepticism and wounded pride I had encountered during my first appearance before them. Word of the neutral powers' growing willingness to formalize relations with humanity had clearly reached Dominion Command through other channels as well, and the prospect of losing influence and standing among those smaller species seemed to weigh more heavily on the Council than the original military defeat ever had. Over the following months, I watched from my post at the border as careful, halting steps toward genuine negotiation began to replace the open hostility that had defined our relationship with humanity for 3 years. Progress was slow, complicated by lingering distrust on both sides, and by factions within the Dominion who continued to view any concession to humanity as an unforgivable weakness. But progress continued nonetheless, driven forward by the simple, undeniable truth that the Thren Nebula had revealed, a truth that no amount of wounded pride could fully erase from the Council's strategic calculations. I think often, even now, of that single moment when I gave the order to surrender, expecting a broken enemy, and receiving instead a calm acknowledgement that would unravel everything I believed about the galaxy's true balance of power. I think of the woman on the bridge of the caldera, her quiet expression of pity as my soldiers approached her, and of Daniel Hart's measured warning that the conversation we were about to have was one he genuinely hoped to avoid. I understand now that humanity's strength was never built on the things we measured so carefully in our military assessments: the size of their fleets, the power of their weapons, the strength of their shields. It was built on something far more difficult to counter: a willingness to hold overwhelming capability in reserve, to demonstrate restraint even in the face of provocation, and to reveal their true power only when every other option had been exhausted, and only in a manner calculated to end conflict rather than prolong it. The galaxy beyond our border has changed since that day near the Thren Nebula, slowly but unmistakably. Species that once watched the Dominion with deference now weigh their choices more carefully, aware that the Empire's military dominance, once considered absolute, had been quietly humbled by a single demonstration that cost no lives and yet changed everything. Humanity, for its part, has made no further demonstrations since that day, content, it seems, to let the message they delivered speak for itself, trusting that those who witnessed it would understand its meaning without need for repetition. I do not know what the coming years will bring, whether the careful negotiations now underway will eventually yield a lasting peace, or whether old grievances and wounded pride will once again push our two civilizations toward open conflict. What I do know, with a certainty that has reshaped everything I once believed about strength and power, is that the galaxy's true nightmare was never the species capable of the greatest destruction. It was the species capable of restraint, even when destruction remained entirely within their grasp, a restraint so complete and so deliberate that when they finally chose to reveal it, an entire empire's certainty in its own supremacy crumbled in the span of a single, quiet afternoon. I gave the order to surrender that day, certain I was demanding capitulation from a desperate and dying enemy. What I received instead was a lesson in humility that I carry with me still, a reminder that the greatest dangers in this galaxy are rarely the ones that announce themselves through force, but the ones patient enough to wait, calm enough to restrain themselves, and confident enough to know that when the moment finally comes to reveal their true strength, no shield, no weapon, and no fleet will be enough to change the outcome. That is the lesson the Thren Nebula taught me, and I suspect it is a lesson the rest of the galaxy is only now beginning to learn for themselves.